Welcome to the second part of your commas lecture. I was hoping to fit all of them into the first 15 minutes, but clearly that didn't work very well. So I am going to rewind a bit and take a closer look at commas 5 and 6 before I move on. Those are the commas that I reviewed a little too quickly in the last one. So let's take a look at adjectival commas. Adjective commas are typically used, or always used really, to separate two or more adjectives that are describing the same noun. Now, in the first example here, he was a difficult, stubborn child. This is a coordinate and requires a comma. And you can tell because you can say he was a difficult child and you can say he was a stubborn child. So it's coordinate and it needs that comma. In the second example, it's non-coordinate and does not need a comma because you can't really say they lived in a white house and they lived in a frame house and it'll mean the same thing. The words work together to describe the house. So you can't separate them and you couldn't take one out. You'll also use a comma, as I mentioned before, at the end of a sentence before a shift or a question in that sentence. Most of the time you'll see these used, particularly when you're ending with a question. For example, you're one of the senator's close friends, aren't you? So you'll see that more commonly than you will the first two examples. He was merely ignorant, not stupid. The chimpanzee seemed reflective, almost human. So in those cases, you need a comma, however, probably not as frequently in formal writing as in informal. Now, free modifiers. A lot of people struggle with free modifiers, particularly when they're starting to build longer sentence constructions and they want to add a sense of fluidity to their writing. But if used incorrectly, a free modifier can confuse rather than entertain. For example, if the modifier is placed in a part of the sentence where it's inappropriate, it can cause confusion, and you never ever want to cause confusion with your reader. For example, Lisa waved at Nancy, laughing joyously. Well, okay. Who is laughing? Lisa or Nancy? Laughing joyously, Lisa waved at Nancy. Now we know it was Lisa that was laughing joyously. You're always going to want to put your free modifier next to the word that it is modifying, or it's not going to make sense. Lisa waved at Nancy, who was laughing joyously. This is also correct. This who always refers back to the immediate person before. Another more bad comedy. Sometime during the night, Howard slipped into a comma. All right, places and dates. Now, places and dates are definitely a time when you're going to want to look up where to place the commas. So if you're confused, then look it up. What most people miss when it comes to places and dates are the comma, I call it the last comma. So we know Birmingham, Alabama. Most people know the city and the state get separated by a comma. We retain that bit of knowledge from elementary school, I hope. However, we often neglect or forget this comma that goes between the state and the first word of the rest of the sentence. Similarly, with the date, July 22nd, 1959. Most people know that one, but then they neglect this one between the number and the first word of the rest of the sentence. Now, The reason for this is multitudinous, and I could go into detail, but generally newspapers like to lose as many commas as possible, and that's one of the commas they lose. However, the comma is there just to make sure that the date is identified as a date and not another kind of number. It's there to prevent confusion or potential confusion. Who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C.? 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the street address doesn't have any commas in between it, and the commas are reserved for after avenue, the city, and the state. When it comes to using someone's credentials, like MD, Rachel B. Lake, comma, MD, comma, will be the principal speaker. Typically, those credentials, like MD or PhD, don't receive any periods in between them or anything like that. Their abbreviations do follow a very particular code, and you can look these up in a grammar book. So if you're wanting to know what the abbreviation for a medical doctor is, you'll look it up. It'll say MD. If you're interested in what a doctor of philosophy, what that looks like, capital P, small h, big D, all smushed together. Now, that gets a comma before and a comma after, simply to set it apart again from the rest of the sentence. When you are quoting, you are going to use a comma to shift between the main discourse and the quotation itself. Now, you should be fairly practiced at this so far, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The only time, though, you are not going to need a comma before a quote is if you're using the word that. Because that indicates that what comes after is a necessary part of the sentence, you don't use a comma with that. If you remember what I said about clauses in the first recording on commas, that and which clauses are treated differently. One's essential, one's not essential. When you use the word that, you're indicating that what comes after is an essential part of the sentence, so you're not going to use a comma. However, if you are introducing a quote without the word that, if you're just using an introductory phrase, like John said without emotion, comma, I'll see you tomorrow, you'll have that comma there between the last word of the introductory phrase and one space before the quotation marks that open the quote. If you are interrupting a quote, you're going to use a comma at the end of the first one and a comma after the phrase. Similarly here in 1848, comma, here these two words are tacked on to the beginning of the sentence. So it's comma number 3, right? It's an intro comma. In 1848, Marx wrote, comma, workers of the world unite. Lastly, you use commas primarily to avoid any kind of confusion or misreading. So, for example, George Harrison is the name of one of the Beatles. If you have two names next to each other and you want to make sure that they're not confused for one name, then you're going to make sure you have a comma in between them, like you do here on the screen. To George, comma, Harrison had been sort of an idol. Now, that is also an intro comma, but sometimes if it's neglected or forgotten, then it will cause confusion in the reader. So make sure you're reviewing your commas periodically. Often I, as the instructor, when I see that there's a repetitive comma error, I'll point you in the direction to a particular comma to review. For example, I'll tell you, please review introductory commas. Please review fanboy commas. Please review date commas, although I don't think I've said that one in a while. If you have any questions about commas, please make sure you bring them to my attention, and I'll do my best to answer them. So, to end for today, some comma tips. Make sure when you're looking for where to place the comma that you're finding the complete sentence. Find your subject, find your verb. Ask yourself, have I tacked on extra words at the end or the start? So if you found your quote-unquote normal sentence, have you added stuff to it? Did you put stuff at the end? Did you put stuff at the beginning? Did you put stuff in the middle? You can also ask yourself if you've used one of the fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. If you can locate for, and then you can locate a subject and a verb at the beginning, and a subject and a verb after that conjunction word, you know you need a comma in front of that conjunction word. The next part of this lecture is on conjunctions, but that's a video for another day. Thanks for joining me.